Chesterton's fence is the idea that if something exists, someone had a reason to create it. Before you tear it down, before you ignore it or change it, you should first understand its reason for existing. Chesterton's fence works not just for the structures around us, beyond our lifetimes, but also for the culture and folklore around us. You may have heard these before. Things like why you should never whistle in the woods, why you should never respond to voices that call for you if you can't see the face they came from, no matter how familiar they are. I received a story recently, a story called It Came from the Cave, from Of the Ojibwe, who claims it is a true story, and that there's something very hungry and very malevolent stalking the woods of Minnesota, looking for meat every decade or so. The Ojibwe have a word for it, but the sender of this story refused to state it here, out of fear. The rules I mentioned before may have been what saved his grandfather and him from a horrible and painful demise. Tell me, dear listeners and viewers, what kind of creature is so terrifying that you can't even speak its name? Something that doesn't look for meat to eat it, but to destroy. I grew up in a hunting family, my mother's side mostly. Her father, Emmett, was the one who taught me to shoot, to track, to clean a deer, and pack out the meat. He had Ojibwe blood from his grandmother, and while we weren't traditional in any formal sense, certain old beliefs had filtered down through the generations and settled into the way he moved through the world. He didn't talk much about them, though. They just were rules you followed without needing to understand why. Like keeping your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. I respected those rules even when I didn't believe in them. I wish I'd asked more questions while he was still around. But I'm here to tell you a story. The story about how one November, something came out of the cave near our cabin. Or maybe it was something that had always been there, waiting in the dark, and that was simply the year it decided to make itself known. Our cabin sat in the northern Minnesota wilderness, about 50 miles south of the Boundary Waters, so remote that the nearest town was about 2 hours by paved road, and from there it was another 40 minutes down a series of old trails that got worse every year. My great-grandfather had built the original structure back in the 1940s, and Emmett had expanded it over the decades, adding a second room and a covered porch that looked out over a small creek. It was primitive by most standards. No electricity or running water, a wood stove for heat and kerosene lamps for light. But I loved it there in a way I've never loved anywhere else. The smell of that place is burned into my memory. That wood smoke and coffee and gun oil smell. Not to mention the wet leaves, pine sap, and mineral scent from the creek. For most of my life, it felt like the safest place on earth. About a quarter mile northeast of the cabin, up a rocky ridge thick with old-growth timber, there was a cave. I don't know how deep it went. I never found out, and I never intend to. The mouth was wide, maybe 15 feet across, and it descended at a shallow angle into absolute darkness. Even on bright summer days, you couldn't see more than 20 feet inside before the light just stopped, like something was eating it. I hated that cave. I hated it as a child, and I hate it now as a grown man. I don't think hate is even the right word. It's more like the feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of a high drop. That twisting pressure in your stomach. That whisper in the back of your skull, telling you to step back. I felt watched whenever I was near it. Studied. Sized up. I told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks. Your brain inventing threats in places it can't see. But over time I noticed that animals avoided the area too. Deer trails curved around that ridge rather than crossing it, and birds did not nest in the trees nearby. My grandfather had one rule about the cave, and he only stated it once. I was maybe 10 years old, and I'd wandered closer than I should have while exploring. He found me standing at the base of the ridge, looking up toward the dark mouth, and he grabbed my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise. He told me I was never to go near it, never to look into it, never to even think about it whenever I was out in these woods. His voice, though, was calm, but there was something underneath it that was different than usual. When I asked why, he shook his head and said some places were better left alone. I assumed he was worried about the practical dangers, like dangerous animals or unstable rocks. That made sense. That was easy for me to believe. So I believed it for 12 more years. My grandfather was not a superstitious man, in the way that most people might use that word. He did not believe in ghosts or UFOs, or any of the things you might see on TV. But he carried certain rules from his upbringing, which had been passed down from his grandmother and her people, and he followed them with a quiet consistency that I only recognized in hindsight. Don't whistle after dark. Do not say the names of the dead in the woods. If you kill an animal, think it. Small things, easy to dismiss as quirks or old habits. But there was one warning that stuck with me, even before I understood why. I was 15, helping him scout a new tree stand location in early autumn. We'd split up to cover more ground, and when I finished checking my section, I called out to him. But he didn't answer. I called again, louder, and I heard his voice respond from somewhere to my left. So I started to walk towards it. Then he was suddenly right in front of me, coming from the opposite direction. I asked him if he'd heard me calling, and he said he had. I asked why he hadn't answered me the first time, and he stopped walking. He said to me that if I ever heard something call my name out in those woods, I should never answer it, not until I could see its face. I remember laughing, thinking he was joking, but his expression didn't change. I wanted to know what he meant. He said that there's something out there that likes to learn voices. It would listen, and it would practice, and eventually, it would try to use it. He said it had a face that I would not want to see. I didn't know what to say to that. I asked if he was serious, and he just told me to remember what he said. Then he started to walk again, and we never spoke about it after that. I thought about it, though. I thought about it every time I noticed him scanning the trees before responding to my shouts. I thought about it every time I caught him standing still, listening to something that I couldn't hear. I told myself it was just an old man's thing, a story he'd been told as a child that had calcified into some habit. I wanted to believe that. The drive up that year was the same as every year before it. We left before dawn and stopped for breakfast at a diner near the highway, then again for gas at the last station before the logging roads began. The truck was loaded with enough supplies for a week. We'd made this trip every season together since I was 12, and there was a comfort in this routine. It felt like a ceremony or ritual. The first thing I noticed was the quietness. Not all the sound was gone. The truck engine rumbled, the tires crunched over gravel and frozen mud. Wind moved through bare branches. But beneath all that, there was a stillness that felt horrible. Normally, the woods this time of year were busy. You'd see movement everywhere, life preparing for winter. But that day, there was nothing. The trees were empty and the underbrush didn't stir at all. I watched through the window as we drove, and I swear I don't think I saw a single living animal in the last 10 miles before the cabin. My grandfather noticed it too. I could tell by the way his hands tightened on the steering wheel. I even caught him flicking his eyes to the tree line a few times. But, as usual, he didn't say anything about it. So neither did I. When we arrived, we unloaded the truck, carried everything inside, and got the wood stove going. By the time the cabin was warm, the sun was starting to sink. I told him I was going to walk the nearby trails before dark, check for deer sign, get a sense of where we should focus in the morning. He nodded and told me not to go too far. There was something in his voice that made me want to ask what was wrong. But I didn't. I wish I had. The trails out there were empty. Not just quiet, but empty. The scrapes and rubs that should have been everywhere, the territorial markings bucks leave during the rut, were completely absent. I walked a full mile in a wide loop around the cabin and found not a single thing to suggest that deer even existed here. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe rut had pushed them further than usual, I thought. But that didn't feel right. Deer don't just abandon an area, not like this, not all at once. When I got back to the cabin, my grandfather was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the darkening woods. He asked what I'd found, and I told him. He didn't seem surprised like I was. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the northeast, toward the ridge, where that cave we couldn't currently see stood. He told me we'd see what morning brought, and then he went inside. I stood out on the porch for a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. Only moments later, I felt watched. So I went inside before the full night came, and I made sure to lock the door behind me. We hunted the next morning anyway, though I think we both knew it was futile. My grandfather suggested we sit stands within sight of each other, rather than spreading out. And I agreed, without a question. We were in our positions before dawn, watching dim light slowly fill the spaces between the trees, waiting for movement that never came. And I mean nothing. Deer, squirrel, bird, nothing. The woods were empty and still like a photograph. I sat in that stand for 4 hours, and that entire time the only living thing I saw was my grandfather, motionless in his own stand about 100 yards away. We climbed down around midday. I was frustrated, ready to complain about the wasted morning, but the expression on my grandfather's face stopped me. He looked nervous. I'd never seen him like that before. His eyes were tired and afraid. I don't think I'd ever seen him afraid of anything. Cautious, sure, but not afraid. We started walking back toward the cabin. I was slightly ahead, following the trail we'd made that morning, when this smell blew in on the wind. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something strange beneath the clean scent of pine and frozen earth. But with each step it grew stronger, until I had to breathe through my mouth. Coppery decay, the unmistakable stench of death. I found the carcass about 50 yards off the main trail. It was a doe, probably a year or two old. She hadn't been dead long either. A day, maybe 2 at most. But something had destroyed her. No other word fits. Her throat had been torn out, not bitten, but ripped. The flesh peeled back from her spine, like someone had tried to separate her head from her body, only to give up partway through. Her belly was open, organs pulled out and scattered across the leaves, but almost none of the meat had been taken. Whatever had killed her had not been interested in eating. I have field-dressed dozens of deer in my life. I've seen what coyotes or even wild dogs do to carcasses, what bears do. What happens when a gut-shot animal runs for a mile before dying and the scavengers find it? This wasn't any of that. This was violence for the sake of violence. It could almost be seen as a message, but at that time, I didn't understand that. The worst part was the tree. About 10 feet away from the carcass, an old oak tree rose from the forest floor. Its bark was gouged with claw marks, deep, vicious slashes torn through to the pale wood beneath. I walked over to it, my boots crunching on frozen leaves, and looked up at the marks. They started at about chest height and ran upward in parallel lines. 4 claws, maybe 5. The highest marks were at least 8 feet off the ground. Whatever had made them had been tall and strong, and it had wanted to leave a record of what it could do. I stood there staring at these marks, trying to make them fit into any category that seemed normal. A bear would be dinning by that time of year, and besides, bears don't kill deer and leave them uneaten. The marks were too large for a cougar, and cougars don't claw at trees like that anyway. I ran through every predator I could think of. Yet, nothing made sense. My grandfather's voice snapped me out of it. He was standing at the edge of the small clearing, looking at the eviscerated doe, and his face was the color of old ash. He asked me to show him the tree, so I did. He studied the claw marks without speaking, reaching up to touch one of the gouges, running his fingers along the bark. Then he looked toward the ridge, once again toward that cave. When I wondered out loud what could have done this, he didn't say a word. He stood for a moment. I saw him grinding his teeth. When his voice finally did come out, it was flat and quiet, and he said we were going to change our plans for the rest of the week. No more morning hunts. We would go out at midday if we went out at all, and we would stay together, making sure to be back inside the cabin before dark. He told me to leave my rifle loaded from now on, even if we're indoors. I was getting frustrated. I didn't like his stoic vagueness during times like this. Why should I continue to be scared and confused when I could just be scared? But I didn't question him. He was wiser than me. He was my elder. So I obeyed. We walked back to the cabin, neither of us talking. I kept my hand on my rifle and my eyes on the trees, watching the shadows between the trunks, searching for any movement. My grandfather walked beside me, and every few steps, I saw him looking over his shoulder, back towards where the cave would be. As we neared the cabin, I stopped. Something made me turn around, some instinct or premonition. I looked back toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the clearing, and I saw something. It was standing between two tall pine trees, about 200 yards away. At that distance, I could barely make out any details at all. I couldn't see a face or features, but I could see the rough shape of it. Something unnervingly tall, and so thin it looked wrong. It stood upright on two legs, but there was nothing human about the way it held itself, the angle of its limbs, and the absolute stillness of its posture. Whatever it was watching us. I knew it because I could feel it watching. In the blink of my eye, it was gone. Just trees and shadows and those empty, silent woods. My grandfather's hand closed around my arm. He'd seen where I was looking, but he pulled me toward the cabin, and I went, because I didn't know what else to do, and I was scared. We didn't speak about it that night. We sat by the wood stove with our rifles across our laps, and we listened to the darkness outside, waiting for morning. I told myself it had to be some sort of dead tree or trick of the light. I didn't believe that. Neither of us slept that night. We didn't discuss it. I doubt my grandfather would. We didn't make any formal arrangements either. It just happened. Just the understanding between two people that something out here was completely messed up, and that we should not make ourselves part of it. My grandfather sat in the chair nearest the wood stove, with his rifle across his knees. I took the cot by the window, my own rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. We kept one kerosene lamp burning low, just enough light to see each other's faces, but not enough to blind us to whatever might be moving in the dark. Remember when I said the cabin had always felt safe to me? It's small, yes, and primitive, but solid. My great-grandfather had built it to last, and my grandfather had maintained it with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. That night, though, it felt like a shell. The walls felt thin, Every creak of settling timber, every gust of wind against the windows sent my heart racing. Then, the sounds started around midnight. They weren't dramatic at first, sounded like a twig snapping somewhere in the distance. Then another, but closer. The rustle of something moving through dead trees, circling wide around the cabin. I thought to myself, it could be anything. Raccoons or possums or deer that had finally wandered back into the area. But the rhythm was wrong. The pauses between sounds were cautious and planned, like something that knew how to move through woods without being heard and was choosing not to. At some point in the early hours, I heard something brush against the exterior wall. It was subtle, almost gentle, but it was higher than a deer could reach. In fact, it was higher than made sense for anything on four legs. I instantly looked at my grandfather with wide eyes. He was gripping his rifle super tight, with one finger against his lips, and a silent, "Hush." Still, we didn't speak, but it made sense now, because if we spoke then, it would know we were there, even though I'm pretty sure it already did. But a sound from us would be confirmation, basically screaming at the thing outside that its prey was right here, behind thin wooden walls. Dawn came slowly. When the first real light broke through the trees, I felt something loosen in my chest. In daylight, the terror of the night before seemed almost silly, until I looked at my grandfather's face and saw that he had not experienced that same relief. He almost looked sick, a man so worried but trying so hard to hide it that it backfired completely. I could have vomited at the sight of that fear just behind his eyes. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the clearing where we'd parked the truck. It was quiet for a long time, but finally he said that we were leaving. Today, now. We'd pack only what we needed and drive out, not coming back until spring, if we came back at all. No arguments from me. I was already reaching for my boots. The truck had been visited. I saw it as soon as we stepped outside, and the relief I'd felt at dawn curdled into something cold and heavy. The driver's side door was marked with scratches, 4 parallel gouges running from the handle to the wheel well. They weren't deep, barely breaking through the paint, but they were clear. Another message. The front left tire was also flat. I crouched down to examine it while my grandfather stood watch. He held his rifle in such a way that he could aim and fire immediately if needed. The tire had not been slashed. Instead, it appeared as though something had bitten through it. I could see the puncture marks, the way the rubber had been pierced and torn by something with teeth. The size of the bite was wide, too large for anything I could name. Around the truck, the ground was churned with tracks. I tried to see where they came or where they went, but they were confusing. There seemed to be no recognizable pattern. They overlapped and contradicted each other. Some were bipedal, the impressions of feet that might have been human if the stride hadn't been so long. Others showed what looked like hands pressing into the mud, as if whatever made them had dropped to all fours, to move faster, or even to smell the ground. The gait shifted randomly between the two, and I could not construct any anatomy that would move that way in my head. My grandfather had a spare tire, luckily, and he changed it, without a word, of course, while I stood guard. It took nearly an hour. The whole time I felt that watching sensation pressing against my back, that awareness of being observed. The woods around the cabin were utterly still. No birds and no wind. Nothing but that terrible, patient attention. When he finished, my grandfather stood and wiped his hands on his pants. He looked up at the sky, gauging the position of the sun. and I saw something in him that made my stomach tighten again. He then said that the old roads would be slow going, muddy, rutted, treacherous in places where erosion had eaten away at the surface, and he said we would not make it to the main road before dark. Then he said we'd have to wait until morning. One more night. We should have stayed inside. I know that now, but the thought of sitting in that cabin for several more hours waiting for darkness to fall was unbearable. My grandfather suggested we scout toward the south, looking for a shorter route out, a path that might cut our drive time enough to give us a margin before sunset. I agreed because I needed to move around. I needed to feel like we were doing something other than waiting to be hunted. We found another carcass, a quarter-mile from the cabin. This one was a buck, a mature 8-point, and it had been dead for several days. The corpse was bloated, the smell was rancid, and it had been destroyed in the same way as the doe we'd found before. I made myself look at it long enough to confirm what I already knew. Then we moved on. That wasn't the end of it. There was another carcass, much fresher. A doe maybe 2 days dead, destroyed in the same way. Then we found a third, and it was still warm. I found it in a shallow ravine, steam still rising from the exposed viscera in the cold morning air. The blood hadn't even congealed yet. Whatever had killed this animal had done it within the last hour, maybe less. It had been alive when we woke up that day. It had been killed while we were changing the tire. My grandfather stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the corpse, and I watched his face as he worked through that same realization that I'd just reached. These kills were not random. They weren't even about food. These were markers, boundary signs. When I thought about the location of each body, the first to the northeast, the second to the east, and the third to the south, I understood. They formed a perimeter around our cabin. Something was marking its territory, and our cabin and us were inside of it. I asked my grandfather what was going on, demanded to know what he knew and what he'd been keeping from me, what any of this meant. My voice came out louder than I intended, cracking, and he didn't answer for a long time. But eventually he simply said we had to go back inside. He talked while the afternoon light faded outside the windows. He did not, obviously, tell me a complete story. He did not lay out some neat narrative with a beginning and middle and end. Instead, he spoke in fragmented, half-finished thoughts, like someone describing something they've spent a lifetime trying to not think about. I didn't push him. I was finally getting some answers, so I just listened. I'll do my best to explain what he said. He'd seen it before. He was young then, 19 or 20 years old, hunting with his grandmother in these same woods during a hard winter when food was scarce and the animals behaved strangely. Something had come to their camp one night. He never saw it clearly, just movement in the darkness, shapes that didn't seem right, sounds that couldn't come from any normal animal. His grandmother was so scared, she made him hide beneath a pile of blankets in the corner of the tent. She told him to stay silent, no matter what he heard, no matter what called his name. She had done something, he didn't know what, some kind of prayer or ritual, words in a language he didn't know. She made these gestures that seemed to push against the darkness outside. And whatever it was, the thing left. They survived the night. Afterward, she told him about something that lived in those old places, saying that it slept for years at a time, sometimes even decades, in hollows, deep woods, or caves. It woke when it was hungry, and when it woke, it killed, and what it hungered for was not food, but death. It killed for pleasure. She said the thing was sick, not an animal and not a spirit, but something caught between. She claimed that it had once been human, maybe, or had worn human shapes, but had been twisted into something nightmarish. It could learn, it could mimic, it could think, and it hated everything that wasn't itself. She told him to never acknowledge it or answer it if it called. Never even let it know you'd seen it. She called it a name that he would not repeat to me, a word from a language that was almost extinct even then. My grandfather's voice broke as he told me this. He said he'd thought it was gone now. He'd thought maybe his grandmother had driven it away for good, or that it had died or moved on in the decades since. He thought maybe it had been just a story all along, an old woman's superstition, a way of making sense of a frightening thing in the night. He said he was sorry to me, that he never should have brought me here. I then asked him what happened to his grandmother. He didn't answer. He stared at the floor, and I knew not to ask that again. The sun was low when I stepped onto the porch to bring in firewood from the stack by the door. I was only outside for a moment, long enough to fill my arms with split logs, to feel the cold air on my face, and to glance toward the tree line out of habit. And it was then that I heard my grandfather's voice calling my name. It came from the trees, not from inside the cabin where I'd left my grandfather, but from out there, maybe 50 yards into the forest. And you want to know what's really messed up? It sounded exactly like him. A perfect copy. That gravel in his tone and the way he pronounced my name with the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It was a quirk of his accent I'd heard my whole life. He was calling me towards him, telling me to come quick, saying that he'd found something. I froze with the firewood in my arms. I could hear my grandfather behind me inside the cabin, the creak of the floorboards under his boots as he walked around. He was still inside. He was right there. So what was out here? The voice called again. Come on, it said. Hurry up, it said. The same tone and cadence. Every detail was spot on. I remembered his warning from years ago. His voice telling me never to answer until I could see a face, so I didn't move or respond or acknowledge it. I stood there with my arms full of wood, staring at the dark line of trees. As if becoming impatient, the third time it called for me, something was wrong with it. While the voice was still my grandfather's, still accurate, there was a wetness underneath it now. A thickness like someone speaking through a mouthful of blood. The words came slower, and I could hear effort behind it. Whatever was doing this, it was straining itself to mimic my grandfather, something that didn't have a human-shaped mouth and was struggling to keep up the act. I backed toward the cabin door. I didn't turn around. I couldn't make myself look away from the trees, from those shadows between the trunks where something might be standing and watching. I got inside, and I locked the door. My grandfather was at the window with his rifle raised, his face a little paler than when I'd left him. He'd heard it too. Night came quickly. We kept the lanterns low and the fire banked, sitting in near darkness with our rifles, watching the windows like the first night. The sounds started soon after full dark. This time they weren't as subtle. We heard footsteps circling the cabin. They weren't constant. They would come in bursts, a dozen steps, then silence, then another burst from a different direction. Sometimes they sounded like a man walking. Sometimes they sounded like something else. A shambling rhythm, an irregular drag and thump that did not match any gait I could imagine. I tried to track the movement, to predict where the next sound would come from, but the pattern kept changing. I got used to the sounds, but not to the silent gaps between, because during those quiet parts, I didn't know where it was or where to expect it. I kept thinking of that movie, Silver Bullet, at the end where the werewolf bursts through the wall. I kept thinking how that could happen here, and I would have no idea which direction it would come. Every time it went quiet, I was wondering if this was the moment it would stop playing and burst through. Once, something pressed against the wall hard enough to make the timber groan, and I could hear breathing on the other side, raspy, wet breathing, like its lungs were full of fluid. The thing sounded sick and diseased and hungry, but something told me that was probably its natural state. Asterisk on natural. I looked at the window then and saw a shape blocking out the stars. Our visitor was very tall and very thin. I could make out the silhouette of a head and shoulders, bony and stretched out features, and a misshapen skull. It stood there for a moment, perfectly still, and I felt its attention on me. But then it moved away, and the window showed only darkness again. Hours passed by. The circling continued. My grandfather whispered that we couldn't show fear, that we could not show any weakness. He said it was studying us and learning us, looking for a crack it could exploit. And he said all we could do, all we should do, was wait it out. A question popped in my head, one that it turned out I didn't want an answer for. That question being, what if it did find a crack? It was the deepest part of the night, and the cold was creeping through the walls, through the floor, through every gap in the old timber frame. But we hadn't heard footsteps in nearly an hour. I was starting to hope it was over, that whatever was out there had lost interest in us. Maybe it had moved on. Then something knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks, almost polite. I looked at my grandfather. All he did was aim his rifle at the door, the barrel trembling slightly in his grip. Another 3 knocks. And then I heard my own voice come through the wood. It said my grandfather's name, asking to be let inside. It said it was cold out here, that it had gotten lost in the dark, to please open the door. Every word was perfect, every aspect of the voice. My mind was boggled by the way it even understood my quirks, the way I swallowed certain syllables. It was me. It was exactly me, my voice, asking my grandfather to open the door. I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat closed up. I couldn't have spoken back to it if I wanted to. My grandfather hovered his finger over the trigger. Then there was silence. Long, stretching silence. Suddenly, from just outside the door, so close it might have been inches from the wood, there was a laugh. Then the footsteps retreated. The presence withdrew, and the night went quiet. Once again, we stayed up as long as we could. We sat in the darkness with our rifles, hoping that we didn't have to use them. Eventually, light seeped through the windows. It was morning, and we'd survived. I felt scraped out, though. My body was aching from hours of tension, but we were alive. The door was intact. Whatever had been outside had not gotten in. My grandfather stood slowly, his joints cracking, and moved to the window. He looked out at the clearing, at the truck, at the tree line beyond, and I watched his face crumble. I walked over and stood beside him. In the clearing, in front of our cabin, arranged in a neat little row, were 7 deer heads. No bodies, just the heads, positioned upright on the stumps of their severed necks, facing the cabin, facing us. Their eyes were open, their mouths hung slack. They'd been placed there with care, with precision, with an attention to detail that spoke of intelligence, and something that was very prideful in its work. They hadn't been there when darkness fell, and yet here they were. My grandfather spoke in a whisper, his voice barely audible, saying that it wasn't going to let us leave. Those deer heads watched us with their glassy eyes, and I understood with a sickening clarity that this was communication, yet another message. This thing communicated through violence, if it wasn't using our own voices. My grandfather broke the silence. He said we were leaving, now, not in an hour, not after we packed anything, not after some plan. Now. I was so relieved to hear that, because I think if we stayed another night, we'd probably end up like the deer heads. So our bags stayed where they'd fallen the day before. The food we'd brought for a week sat untouched on the counter. I grabbed only my gun and a handful of extra cartridges from the table and the truck keys. My grandfather did the same, that was all. At the door he paused. I watched his lips move silently, forming words, and I realized he was praying. He was reciting something. Made me think it was a fragment of what he heard his grandmother speak all those years ago in a tent while something outside circled them. At the time, I wasn't sure if I believed it would help. I don't know if he remembered the words correctly, but he said them anyway. And then he opened the door. The morning air was biting cold. The sky was overcast. We walked to the truck. I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning for any movement. But I couldn't stop glancing at those deer heads as we passed, 7 of them, arranged in a perfect row. It was so creepy. We made it to the truck without an issue. I unlocked the doors and we climbed in, and the sound of those locks clicking shut was music to my ears. The engine turned over with no problem, and I put it in gear and started down the road, away from that cabin, and especially away from that cave. But that road was worse than I remembered. There were ruts filled with half-frozen mud, sucking at the tires. Sections where spring erosion had carved channels across the path, forcing me to slow to a crawl painfully. I had to pick my way through terrain that threatened to swallow the wheels. We couldn't go too fast. I wanted to floor it, believe you me, to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. But the road would not allow it. For the first mile, there was nothing, just the grinding of tires on rough ground. But then I saw movement, parallel to the road, about 30 yards into the trees. There I saw a shape flickering between the trunks, keeping pace with us. I actually saw it. Brief glimpses, but I saw it. Pale skin, angular juts of limbs, something tall and thin moving through the forest with a speed that should not have matched our vehicle, even in these rough conditions. It seemed like every time I glanced, it was switching positions between 4 legs and 2. It didn't seem to be chasing us or running away. I felt like it was escorting us, matching our speed exactly, staying just visible enough that we knew it was there. My grandfather watched it too, but he didn't say anything, as was his way. He watched it through the window, his face like a stone statue. I drove faster, knowing it was probably a little risky, and the shape in the woods kept pace without effort. We rounded a bend, and I slammed on the brakes, because across the road lay a tree, a fallen, mature pine, 3 feet thick at the base, completely blocking our path. The crown stretched into the woods on the left side. The root ball jutted up on the right, a wall of tangled roots and clinging earth. At first I thought maybe the wind had blown it over, but that was stupid, I thought. I'd been out here the whole time. There was no storm, no wind strong enough to do this. Instead, it looked like it had been torn from the ground, uprooted. And then I saw them, the parallel gouges, the claw marks. Yep, it hadn't fallen, it had been placed there. My grandfather was already opening his door. I called out for him to wait. I had to think about this, but he shook his head and said we had no time and no choice. The woods on either side were too dense to drive through. We couldn't go back. We had to move this tree, and we had to do it now. He told me to stay in the truck, keep the engine running, to watch the trees and be ready. Before I could reply, he was outside, moving to the front bumper, unwinding the winch cable mounted there. I watched him nervously through the windshield. I was more scared for him than myself. He worked quickly, wrapping the cable around the trunk, securing it with the hook. When he was ready, he signaled me. I put the truck in reverse and gave it gas, and I felt the cable go taut. The tires bit into the mud, and the tree began to move. Slowly, but it was definitely coming along, scraping across the road. I was watching the tree, making sure it kept moving, but I should have been watching the woods. The shape emerged from the shadows behind my grandfather. It stepped out from between two thick pine trees, 20 yards away, and for the first time I saw it so clearly. Not a glimpse, not a silhouette in the darkness. I saw it in the pale morning light, and I will never unsee that for as long as I live. It stood upright on two legs. It stood about 7 feet tall, maybe more than that. But it was so thin, its height seemed more like a mockery. It had these extra joints in places, suggesting extra articulation. It had mottled pale skin, almost white, like the belly of a dead fish. Half hairless, too, covered in what looked like mange or maybe rot. I could see the juts of ribs and hips through its skin, the knobs of spine. Its skull was elongated, stretched backward, the jaw hanging open to reveal teeth that didn't seem to fit its mouth. They were jagged, uneven, some short and blunt, others long and curved like hooks. The eyes were set too far apart and were quite large. They reflected light as if they were glowing from within. Those eyes revealed a creature that was smart, filled with malice and hunger. But it also seemed excited. Even though it looked sick and diseased and ancient, it looked, oh, so happy to be here with us. This thing looked like it should have died 1,000 years ago, but simply said no and kept going, clinging to existence through sheer spite and appetite. I shouted a warning, but my grandfather had already seen it. He stood, frozen, the winch cable still in his hands, staring at the thing that had emerged from the woods. I expected him to run, to raise his rifle, to do something, but he stood there instead, and he spoke to it. Now, I could not hear the words through the glass. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I did see his lips move slowly. He wasn't screaming or pleading for his life, but saying something carefully. His posture shifted as he spoke. He wasn't at all trying to make himself look aggressive or intimidating. I wasn't sure what he was trying to accomplish. His shoulders had dropped and his chin lifted. He looked at the creature and he spoke to it as if he knew it, like they had unfinished business. Remembering my grandfather's story, perhaps that was the case. He had words for this creature that had to be said. The creature tilted its head. The gesture was more curious, almost mocking. It stood motionless, those terrible eyes fixated on my grandfather. And for a while I was certain it was going to rush forward and tear him in half. I had my hand on the door handle, ready at any moment to throw myself out and get in the middle of it, but probably just die uselessly, trying to save him. However, it didn't attack. It stepped back, one step then another. Instead of turning away, it just backed up. It withdrew, fading into the darkness of the forest, glowing eyes the last thing to disappear. My grandfather stood there, staring where it was for a moment. Then he dropped the cable, walked back to the truck, and climbed inside. His face was blank. His hands were shaking something fierce. He told me to drive. With the tree out of the way just enough, I was able to. God, I wanted so bad to ask what he'd said to it. How did he save the both of us with nothing more than words? I put the truck into gear, edging past the half-cleared tree, branches scraping against the doors. I didn't care about any damage. I'm sure he didn't either. We just wanted to get out of those woods. We drove, and the shape in the trees followed us for another mile, maybe 2. I kept seeing glimpses of it between the trees. Frankly, I wasn't sure when it stopped following us. It wasn't the kind of thing where it had a moment of departure or final sighting. It was there 1 second and gone the next. And the moment it wasn't there, the entire woods, the entire universe to us, felt different. It felt before like we were under the entire ocean, this immense pressure. And it completely lifted whenever that creature could no longer be seen or felt. My grandfather sold the cabin, so we never had to go back, as if we wanted to. For all I know, it's collapsed by now, or just sitting empty in those woods, slowly rotting, becoming reclaimed by the forest. But I'll never find out. I don't care to now trespass and go check. My grandfather, though, he acted different after that trip. Drained, somehow quieter than usual. He stopped hunting entirely. When I found out he sold his rifles, I was astonished. And when asked about it, he told people he'd lost his taste for hunting. One time he even said that his knees no longer allowed him to walk that way anymore. He said a lot of things that weren't true. But I never spoke up. I never contradicted him. Only one time did I try to talk to him about it, maybe 6 months after these incidents. I asked what he'd said in the woods to that creature, what words he could have said to make it turn away and spare us. But he shook his head, saying simply that some things are better left buried. But he did say that his grandmother had given him a gift that he'd used, and that was all I needed to know. 3 years later, he had a heart attack, and he didn't make it. His health hadn't been great for a while. It was heartbreaking, but not necessarily surprising. A natural cause. Much better than both of us being mauled to death by something that shouldn't exist. But the timing is pretty close to these events, and it makes me wonder if he had bargained with the thing. Is that possible? Was that the type of entity we were dealing with? Something that could bargain with souls? Had he sold himself to save me? I've looked for information over the years. Old stories from the Ojibwe or the Cree, the other peoples who lived in those lands before anyone else. I've even gone over some cryptid forums and paranormal databases, found a few dusty old books in university libraries. And while I've found some things that match, there's never a perfect match. So, like most stories you might hear like this, I don't know what it was. Or is. I don't know where it comes from or how old it is, why it chose that place to make its home, and why it let us go. That thing could have killed us any time it wanted, could have taken us in the cabin on that first night, could have dragged us from the truck. It could have run us down on the road like the deer it slaughtered and left to rot. It could have been our heads on those stumps, not deer. It was faster, clearly stronger, maybe even smarter. We were never a threat to it. We did not escape from it. we were released. No matter who you are or where you're from, people will tell you to listen to your elders. And sometimes that advice may just save your life. Elders know things. They know why things exist or why other things happen. And even though you may not know the same things as them, that's why it's so useful to just listen sometimes before you cross a boundary that can never be uncrossed. Good night. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to another episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. It's been a pleasure to be your host today. Be sure to send me your scary true stories of the unknown at darkstories.org. If you're listening on YouTube, you can actually find Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or if you're on a podcast app listening right now, you can listen on YouTube instead, on my channel Darkness Prevails, whichever floats your boat. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.